The cold was a living thing. It had teeth and a grip, and it was gnawing on Clara's fingers through her wet wool mittens. Dawn was nothing but a faint crack of gray in the east, promising only a brighter, colder light. The pine branch in her hand was slick with frost, and when she tried to break it over her knee, the wood was too frozen to snap. She had to drop it, place one soaked boot on the middle, and pull with both hands. The sharp crack echoed in the silence of the high plains. Her boots, thin-soled and cracked, had let the snow in an hour ago. Her feet were numb, distant things she could no longer feel. She gathered the last of the branches, her hands raw and red where the skin had split, and bundled them against her chest. Each breath was a cloud of white smoke. The ranch house was small, barely a dark shape against the snow-covered ridge, with only a thin curl of smoke rising from its stone chimney. She had been here 6 months, and the cold still felt like a personal insult, a constant reminder of how little stood between her and the wind. Inside, the warmth was meager, but it was warmth. It smelled of wood smoke, old bedding, and the faint, sweet scent of the onion soup she kept simmering on the hearth. She dropped the wood into the box with a hollow clatter, careful not to wake them, but they were already stirring. "Clara?" a voice whispered from the darkness of the alcove. It was Elspeth Hale, Beckett's mother. "I'm here, ma'am," Clara said softly, her voice still rough with the cold. She moved to the bed, a simple frame of pine logs lashed together with rawhide. "Just bringing in the wood for the day. Go back to sleep." "Can't sleep." The old woman's hand, a pale, papery thing, fumbled for her. Clara took it. Elspeth's eyes were milky with cataracts, seeing the world only in blurs of light and dark. "I dreamed of Beckett again. He was riding home. He looked so tall." Clara's throat tightened. She squeezed the old hand. "That's a nice dream." "Elspeth, he ain't coming." The voice from the other bed was a gravelly rasp. Jedediah Hale, Beckett's father. He was propped against a thin bolster, his great frame shrunken by sickness, where his wife's eyes were clouded. His were just dark, lost in the shadows of his face. He was completely blind. "He left us, took the inheritance, and left his folks to die in the dirt he owns." "Jed, don't talk so," Elspeth fretted. "He'll be back. Our boy will come back. He's been gone 5 years. Woman, 5 years is forever." Clara said nothing. She had heard this exchange 100 times. It was the wound this house was built on. Their son, Beckett Hale, had inherited this land, this river valley, and a great deal of money from a distant uncle 5 years prior. The story, as his parents told it, was simple and cruel. The wealth had poisoned him. He had signed the papers, looked at the modest ranch where he was raised, and turned his back on it and them. Clara moved to the hearth. She took the small sack of flour from the shelf. There was perhaps a pound left. It would have to last. She added a sprinkle to the broth to thicken it, stirring with a wooden spoon. She prepared 2 bowls, adding a torn piece of yesterday's bread to each. She brought one to Elspeth, helping her sit up. "You're a good girl, Clara," Elspeth murmured, fumbling for the spoon. Clara guided it to her hand. "The Lord sent you to us." Clara's face burned. She felt like a fraud. She hadn't been sent by any lord. She had been cast out by a man who claimed to speak for him. She fed Jedediah herself, spooning the thin stew past his bearded lips. He ate with a grim, silent hunger. She tended to them both, cleaning their faces with a damp cloth, smoothing their blankets. They were frail, half-blind, and wholly dependent on her. And they believed their son, the man whose name was on the deed to the very ground beneath them, had abandoned them to starve. She had arrived 6 months ago, a ghost in a ragged shawl, stumbling through the first snow of autumn. She had found them near death. The cabin was freezing, the larder empty. Jedediah was delirious with fever. Elspeth too weak to leave her bed. Clara, who had been running on nothing but fear for 3 days, had stopped. She had found an axe, chopped wood, started a fire, and boiled the last of the dried beans. She had been here ever since, when she rode the one remaining mule into the small town of Sweetwater, 20 miles down the valley. The whispers followed her like stray dogs. She felt the eyes on her back in the mercantile. Mrs. Gable, the proprietor's wife, counted her few coins with a look of distaste, as if the silver was tainted by her touch. The men on the boardwalk would stop talking when she passed, their gazes lingering. They all knew her, or thought they did. They had a name for her. The Preacher's Shame. It was a brand burned onto her by Silas Croft 6 months ago. She had been Clara Middleton, a laundress for the First Episcopal Church in Sweetwater. It was hard, hot work, her hands perpetually raw from lye soap and scalding water. But it was a roof, it was food, and it was, she had thought, respectable. Silas Croft, the preacher's son, had thought otherwise. He was a man with a slick, handsome face, a damp smile, and a belief that the world owed him whatever he desired. He would come into the laundry room, leaning against the doorframe, talking to her while she scrubbed the linens. His talk was first of salvation, then of her beauty, then of the loneliness of a man in his position. She had ignored him. She had kept her head down, her knuckles scrubbing the board until they bled. She knew his kind. His piety was a thin coat of paint on rotting wood. One evening, he had not just talked. He had come in after dark, when the other women were gone. He had blocked her path, his breath smelling of whiskey and peppermint. He had told her she was meant for better things than scrubbing his father's robes. He had told her God would not mind a small sin between two people who understood each other. He had grabbed her wrist when she had refused, pushing him away with a gasp of fear. His face had changed. The slick smile vanished, replaced by a cold, reptilian fury. He had torn his own shirt collar. He had shouted. 2 days later, Preacher Croft himself had stood at the pulpit and delivered a sermon on the serpent in their midst. He spoke of a temptress, a Jezebel who had tried to lure his virtuous son from the path of righteousness. He did not say her name. He did not have to. The entire town had seen Silas, his face a mask of sorrowful regret, and they had seen Clara, pale and silent in the back pew. She was dismissed that afternoon. The boarding house owner told her to be gone by morning. No one would sell her so much as a loaf of bread. She was 20 years old, with no family to her name and nowhere on earth to go. The brand of moral disgrace was absolute. So she had walked. She had left Sweetwater with her small bundle of clothes and walked until her feet blistered and bled. She had slept in ditches, eaten wild berries, and prayed not for salvation, but for an end. Then she had found the Hale Ranch, cold, desolate, and forgotten. It had felt like finding her own grave, until she heard the weak cough from inside. In saving them, she had, for a time, saved herself. Now, her days were a long, unbroken chain of work. She woke before the sun. She gathered wood. She fed the 2 old souls who were her only shield against the world. She fed the half-dozen chickens, milked the single, bony cow, and checked the traps she had set by the river. She cooked, she cleaned, she mended their clothes and hers. She nursed them, changing bandages on Jedediah's bed sores, making willow bark tea for Elspeth's aches. She was earning her keep, every single minute, but the fear never left her. This was not her home. This was Beckett Hale's land. If he ever returned, he would find a strange, disgraced woman living in his house, eating his food, and caring for the parents he had discarded. What would a rich man do? He would drive her out. He would throw her back into the snow, back to the world that had already condemned her. The loneliness was a physical ache, sharper than the cold. She missed the simple sound of her own name spoken without pity or accusation. She missed a conversation that was not about the past, or about a son who never wrote. Sometimes, mending Jedediah's socks by the fire, she would pretend. She would imagine this was her home, that these were her kin, that she was safe. But the fantasy was as thin as the stew. The wind howling outside always brought her back. Far to the south, Beckett Hale was riding north. He had been riding for 3 weeks, pushing himself and his horse to the limit. He was a wealthy man, but he did not look it. He wore a sheepskin coat worn slick at the elbows, canvas trousers, and a hat pulled low against the relentless wind. He was broad-shouldered, with a hard face carved by sun and silence. He, too, had been in exile, 5 years of it. But his was self-imposed. He had not left his parents because of the money. He had left because of the blood. The inheritance from his uncle had not just been money and land. It had come with a feud. His cousins, the eastern branch of the family, had contested the will. They had come to Wyoming, not with lawyers, but with guns. It had ended in the dust outside the saloon in Sweetwater. Beckett had been faster. He had killed his cousin, a man he had grown up with, and the legal fight had died with him. The town had called it self-defense. The law had agreed. But Beckett called it something else. He had looked at the land, at the money, and at his parents' hopeful faces, and all he had seen was the blood spattered on the dust. He could not stay. He could not be the son they wanted, not with that mark on him. He had left them the ranch, set up an account at the bank in Cheyenne for them, and sent word to an old friend to look in on them. Then he had vanished into the mountains, working as a ranch hand, a trapper, a guide, anything that was not an owner, anything that was not responsible for anything but the next day. He had not trusted himself with the money, or with the love of his parents. Then the letter had found him, passed from one traveler to another until it reached his camp in the high Uintas. It was from August Reed, his closest neighbor. Though their homesteads were 30 miles apart, it was short, the handwriting shaky. Beckett, you need to come home. Your folks are failing. Jedediah is blind, and Elspeth is not far behind. I have not seen smoke from their chimney in a week. I went over. They are in a bad way. I fear they may be dying. Son, they are alone. The letter was 2 months old. He had ridden since that day. He rode through the high passes, fording rivers where the ice was just beginning to form, crossing wide, empty basins where the wind never stopped. The land was his. All of it, as far as he could see, the deep snow on the rocky ridges, the wide gray river frozen solid in its banks, the pale sun hanging low in the sky. He owned it all, and it meant nothing. At night, the coyotes howled, their voices thin and desperate, and they sounded, to him, like the voices of regret. He saw the ranch just as the sun was beginning to set, staining the snow caps in shades of pink and orange. His heart hammered against his ribs. The ranch looked dead. The fences were down. The barn roof partially collapsed. August's letter had been right. He had stayed away too long. He had waited until there was nothing left to come home to. But as he got closer, he saw it. A thin, frail line of gray smoke rising from the chimney. Someone was there. August, maybe. He dismounted, his legs stiff. He pulled his rifle from its scabbard, just in case. He moved to the door. It was his door. He did not knock. He pushed it open. The cabin was dim, lit by the fire and a single oil lamp. It was warm. It smelled of onion and thyme. And there was a woman. She was standing with her back to him, stirring a pot over the hearth. She was small, shockingly thin, wearing a dress that looked like it was made of old flour sacks. Her brown hair was tied back in a simple, severe knot. Beckett's blood ran cold. A squatter. Someone had found his parents dead and simply moved in. His voice was a rasp, hard as stone. "Who in the hell are you?" Clara dropped the spoon. It clattered against the stone hearth. She spun around, her eyes wide with pure, animal terror. She saw a man filling the doorway, a massive silhouette against the dying light, a rifle in his hand. This was it, the moment she had dreaded every day for 6 months. Beckett Hale had come home. She backed away, pressing herself against the wall. "Sir, please, I was just—" The noise woke the old folks. "Clara?" Jedediah's voice was sharp with alarm. "What is it? Who's there?" "Our girl?" Elspeth cried out. Sitting bolt upright, she fumbled at her side. "Clara, where are you?" Beckett froze. He looked from the terrified woman to the 2 beds in the alcove. His parents were alive. They were thin, they were old, but they were alive. He saw his mother, her hand outstretched, her face frantic. He saw his father, struggling to sit. his blind eyes wide and staring toward the door. "Pa?" Beckett's voice cracked. Jedediah went still. "Beckett, is that you, boy?" "I'm here, Pa." He moved into the room, lowering the rifle, his mind reeling. Elspeth began to weep, a thin, gasping sound. "He's home. Jed, our boy is home." But his parents were not looking at him. They were reaching for the strange woman. Jedediah's hand found her ragged sleeve, and he gripped it tight. "It's all right, girl. It's our son." Elspeth was clinging to Clara's other hand, pulling her close as if for protection. "Our girl," she whispered, stroking Clara's arm. "She's been taking care of us. Beckett, she saved us." Beckett stared. His gaze moved from his parents, clinging to this stranger, to the woman herself. She was trembling, pale as the snow outside, her eyes fixed on him in terror. He looked around the small cabin. It was clean. The floor was swept. There were mended blankets on his parents' beds. A pot of stew, smelling rich and real, simmered on the fire. He had come home expecting a grave. He had found his parents alive. And this woman was the reason. The anger and confusion were still swirling in him, but they were being pushed aside by a vast, humbling shame. He looked at the pot, then at his father's thin face, then back to the girl. His voice was rough, choked with 5 years of guilt and a sudden, sharp clarity. "She's feeding my parents?" Clara flinched, expecting a blow or a curse, but the question hung in the warm, quiet air. Not as an accusation, but as a statement of fact. His suspicion was still there, a hard glint in his eyes, but it was fading. He was seeing, for the first time, not the squatter he had imagined, but the woman who had taken his place. The house was the same, yet entirely different. Beckett Hale felt like a ghost in his own skin, sleeping on a rough pallet near the door while Clara took his old cot. The first few days, he moved with the stiffness of an intruder. He was confused. He had returned, bracing himself for death and silence, and instead found this quiet, fierce resilience in the form of a woman who looked like she might shatter if he spoke too loudly. He was humbled. His parents, whom he had left in capable hands, or so he'd thought, had been saved by this wisp of a girl. She had done what he had failed to do. She had stayed. Clara, for her part, was a model of rigid formality. She kept her eyes downcast, her voice barely a whisper. She called him Mr. Hale, in a tone that put 1,000 miles between them. Even in the cramped cabin, she woke before him, had the fire going and the thin coffee boiling, and seemed to glide from one chore to another, desperate to prove her worth. Every time he entered a room, she would flinch and find a reason to leave it. She was waiting, he knew, for the axe to fall. She was waiting for him to tell her to pack her meager bundle and face the snow. He watched her. He was a man who observed things. The turn of a cow's head, the shift in the wind, the shadow of a hawk on the rocks. He watched her measure the flour, her movements precise, careful not to waste a single grain. He watched her break the ice in the water trough, her hands so red they looked scalded. He saw how she served the meals. The largest portions went to his father, then his mother, then she would offer him a share that was nearly as large. Only then, if anything remained, would she take a small plate for herself, eating quickly, as if she had no right to the food. The sight of her thinness, the hollows beneath her cheekbones and the fragile line of her wrists, gnawed at him. This woman was starving herself to keep his parents fed. On the third morning, he found her outside, struggling with the heavy axe, trying to split a frozen log. She swung the axe with all her might, but it bounced off the iron-hard wood. She was breathing hard, her thin shawl offering no protection against the biting wind. He walked up behind her. "Give me that!" She gasped and spun around, dropping the axe. "Mr. Hale, I was just—" He said nothing. He took the axe from the snow, noting its worn handle. He spread his legs, swung the tool, and buried the blade deep in the wood. With a grunt, he tore the log in two. He set about splitting the rest, the rhythmic thud and crack the only sound between them. Clara stood there, useless, her hands clasped together, shivering. "Go inside," he said, not looking at her. "You'll freeze." She hesitated, then scurried back to the house. From that day, he began to help. It was an awkward, silent partnership. He took the heavier tasks: the wood, the water, the shoveling of paths through the deepening snow. He went out with his rifle and came back with 2 rabbits, hanging them from the porch. He found his old tools and began repairing the barn roof, his hands numb, his breath pluming. She would follow, bringing him hot coffee in a tin mug, or standing by to hand him the hammer. They rarely spoke. A thank you from him. A yes, sir, from her. The silence was thick, charged with everything unsaid, his guilt, her fear. He was the master of the house who had abandoned it. She was the stranger who had saved it. The imbalance was a chasm between them. One night, the deep, aching cold of the cabin kept him awake. His parents were asleep. Jedediah's breath a rattling snore. Elspeth's a quiet sigh. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, casting a weak, pulsing red light. He sat up on his pallet, rubbing his arms, and saw her. She was not asleep. She was sitting at the small table, her back to him, a single lantern burning beside her. She had her mending basket out and was stitching a tear in one of his father's woolen shirts. Her head was bowed, her hair a dark shadow. He was about to say something, to tell her to get some rest, when he saw her shoulder hitch. It was a small movement, instantly suppressed. He watched, unmoving. She paused in her sewing, and her other hand came up to press against her mouth. A terrible, silent sob racked her small frame. She bent lower over the shirt, as if trying to hide from the very air. A single tear dropped onto the dark wool. She wiped it away with a fierce, quick motion of her sleeve, took a shuddering breath, and threaded the needle again. Beckett sat frozen on his pallet. He felt like he was looking at something he had no right to see. It was the rawest, most private grief. This was not just fatigue. This was a deep, bottomless sorrow. He thought of her in this cabin, alone for months with 2 ailing old people, riding to a town that clearly despised her. He thought of her starvation, her constant work, her terror of him. Something inside his chest, something he'd thought long dead and frozen, stirred. It was a hot, protective ache. He wanted to go to her, to put his coat around her shoulders, to tell her what? He had no words. He was the cause of her fear, not its solution. He lay back down, pulling the blanket over his head, but he did not sleep. He listened to the tiny sounds of her smothered weeping and the soft scrape of her needle until the lantern light finally went out. The next day, the world changed. The wind, which had been a constant, sharp presence, turned into a howl. It came from the north, a solid wall of white. Snow began to fall, not in flakes, but in horizontal sheets. By noon, the windows were covered. By dusk, the wind shrieked like a dying animal, rattling the cabin door in its frame. "A blizzard," Jedediah said from his bed, his voice grim. "This is a bad one. Son, the kind that buries." For 3 days, the world shrank to the 4 walls of the cabin. They were trapped. The air grew thick and close, smelling of unwashed bodies, stale cook smoke, and fear. They could not open the door without a wall of snow falling inside. The wind was so loud they had to shout to be heard. This forced proximity was a new kind of torture. Beckett was suddenly, acutely aware of her. He was aware of the space she took up, which was as little as possible. He was aware of the scent of her, a faint smell of lye soap, and, when she passed close, the warmth of her skin. They bumped into each other by the hearth. They reached for the same kettle. Their world was now only 12 paces long, and she was in it, every minute. The tension was a physical thing, like the pressure of the snow against the walls. The long silences stretched, broken only by the wind or his mother's fretting. "It must have been hard," Beckett said one afternoon, his voice too loud in the storm-muffled room. Clara, who was checking the flour bin, froze. "Sir?" "Being here, alone, with them." She turned, her hands white with flour. She looked at his parents, who were dozing. They're good people, Mr. Hale." "That's not what I asked." She looked down at her hands. She would not, or could not, be familiar. I was grateful for the roof. He pushed, frustrated by her walls. "Where did you come from? Clara? Sweetwater?" Her name on his lips sounded strange. Too intimate. She flinched, her gaze flying to his. It was the first time he had used it. "I was in Sweetwater for a time," she whispered. "And before that?" She turned back to the bin. Her shoulders hunched. I had nowhere left to go." Her voice was flat, empty, and final. It was a door slamming shut. He was a fool to have pushed. He had seen her weep. He knew there was a story there, and he knew it was not his to ask for. The latch on the cabin door, old and rusted, chose that moment to freeze solid. The wind had driven ice deep into the mechanism. Beckett worked at it with his knife, cursing under his breath. If they could not open the door, they were in a tomb. "Bring the lantern," he ordered. Clara came and stood beside him, holding the light steady. The circle of yellow light illuminated his hands, broad and scarred. As they wrestled with the frozen iron, he could feel her beside him. He could feel the warmth radiating from her arm, though they were not touching. The kettle," he grunted. "Maybe some hot water." She turned to get it, and as she turned back, her sleeve brushed his hand. It was nothing, a thread of wool against his skin, but it felt like a brand. Both of them recoiled. She gasped softly and pulled her arm back as if burned. He jerked his hand away from the latch. They stared at each other for a beat, their breath clouding in the cold air near the door. The wind howled, covering the sudden, ringing silence between them. She looked away first, her face crimson. "The water, sir." "Right," he said, his voice a rasp. He took the kettle and poured the steaming water, his own hand unsteady. The breaking point came on the 4th day of the storm. Clara had been tireless, rationing the last of the salted pork, making a thin soup, tending to Elspeth, who had grown fearful in the endless darkness. Beckett was reinforcing the window shutter when he heard his father cry out. "Clara! Girl, what is it?" He turned. Clara was swaying on her feet, one hand pressed to the cabin wall for support. Her face was a shocking, waxy white. I'm just," she whispered. Then her eyes rolled back, and she collapsed, a heap of worn calico on the floor. "Clara!" Elspeth shrieked. Beckett was across the room in 2 strides. He knelt, turning her over. She was frighteningly light. Her skin was burning, exhaustion, starvation, and the relentless cold had finally claimed her. She was in a high fever. "She's sick," Jedediah said, his voice cracking with fear. "Beckett, our girl is sick." A fierce, cold panic seized Beckett. He had come home to find his parents dying, and now the woman who had saved them was dying in their place. "No," he said, the word a vow. He lifted her. She weighed almost nothing. He carried her to his own cot by the fire, the warmest place in the house. He covered her with his own sheepskin coat. "Ma, boil water," he ordered, his voice taking on a command he hadn't used in 5 years. "Pa, just be quiet." For the next 2 days, the storm raged outside, and a different storm raged inside the cabin. Beckett Hale did not sleep. He became a nurse, a role so foreign to him it felt like a dream. His movements, usually rough and certain, became surprisingly gentle. He bathed her face and her thin wrists with a cloth dipped in cool water. Her skin was dry, burning hot. He brewed the last of the willow bark, forcing the bitter tea between her cracked lips. He made broth from the last rabbit bone, and when she wouldn't, or couldn't, swallow, he would lift her head, cradling it in his arm, and spoon the liquid into her mouth, whispering, "Come on, girl, drink. You have to drink." His parents watched in silence, their fear a tangible thing. Clara was lost. She thrashed in the cot, her hands tangling in the blankets, and she talked. Her voice was a dry, broken whisper, but in the close confines of the cabin, every word was audible. "No," she whimpered, turning her head from side to side. "Please, no, don't touch me." Beckett, who had been about to wipe her forehead, froze. His hand hovered over her. "It was a lie," she cried, a tear slipping from her closed eye and sizzling on her hot cheek. "He told them all. The preacher. His son. Such a good man." Her voice was full of a terrible, cutting sarcasm. "Shame. He said shame. Everyone looking." Beckett sat on the stool, his heart aching. He listened as the fragments of her delirium painted a picture of betrayal, a preacher's son, lies, public shame, and a deep, abiding fear of being touched. He understood now. He understood her terror of him, her silent weeping, her refusal to meet his eye. It was not just shyness. It was a wound. "Get away," she whispered, her hands weakly pushing at the heavy coat. "Don't look at me. I'm the preacher's shame." He lowered his hand, but not to her face. He just rested it on her shoulder. A heavy, solid weight, letting her know she was not falling. "You're all right," he murmured, his voice rough. "You're safe. No one is here but us." He did not press her. He did not ask. He just sat, listening to her nightmares and the howl of the wind, his heart hardening with a cold rage against the unknown man who had done this. On the 5th day, the wind stopped. The silence was as sudden and profound as a gunshot, and in that silence, Clara's fever broke. She woke late in the afternoon. The world was quiet, the light in the cabin gray and strange. She was weak, her body aching, but her mind was clear. She was in a cot by the fire. She was covered with a heavy, man-smelling sheepskin coat. She turned her head. Beckett was sitting in a chair, watching her. His face was shadowed, covered in a 5-day growth of beard. He looked exhausted. Mortification flooded her, hot and immediate. "Mr. Hale." Her voice was a croak. I'm sorry." She tried to sit up, but the coat was too heavy, her limbs too weak. "Don't," he said. His voice was quiet, stripped of its usual hardness. "Be still. You've been sick. My chores. Your parents." "They're fine. I fed them." He nodded to a mug on the hearth. "There's broth." He brought it to her, holding it while she drank. She was too weak to hold it herself. She drank, her eyes on the rough stitching of his cuff. She was deeply aware of his proximity, of his large hand near her face, but the fear was different. It was muffled, overlaid by the memory of a low voice in her fever, a solid presence that had not hurt her. That evening, the silence returned, but it was no longer heavy. It was restful. His parents, relieved, had eaten and fallen into a deep sleep. The blizzard had passed, leaving them buried in a world of white. Beckett stoked the fire, the light playing over his face. He looked at his parents, then at Clara, who was watching him from the cot. The cabin was too quiet. He got up and went to a small, dusty shelf near his mother's bed. He pulled out a book. It was an old volume, its leather cover cracked and faded. He brought it back to the chair. He cleared his throat. "My mother used to like this." He opened it. He began to read, his voice deep and hesitant at first, sounding out the unfamiliar words. It was Shakespeare, The Tempest. "Be not afeared," he read, his voice growing stronger as he settled into the rhythm. "The isle is full of noises, sounds and sweet airs that give delight and hurt not." Clara listened. She had never been read to. The sound of his voice, filling the small, warm cabin, was a balm. The storm howled outside, a distant, muffled thing. But inside, there was only the fire, his sleeping parents, and this man's voice, telling a story of shipwrecks and magic. She watched his face in the firelight. She saw the way his brow furrowed in concentration, the way his gaze was fixed on the page. He was not the millionaire cowboy who had abandoned his family. He was not the terrifying owner come to cast her out. He was not the memory of Silas Croft, with his wet smile and cruel hands. He was just a man, reading a book by the fire, his voice a shield against the dark. And for the first time in more than a year, Clara Middleton felt something that resembled peace. Their connection, fragile and unspoken, began to deepen in the shared quiet. long after he had closed the book and the cabin had fallen into a soft, firelit dark. The storm broke, but the world it left behind was a white desert, silent and deep. The thaw came slowly, in drips and trickles. For a week, the cabin remained their island. The tension that had snapped during Clara's fever had not returned. In its place was a quiet, careful awareness. Beckett's voice, which he had used to read of enchanted islands, was softer now. Clara's fear, while not gone, had retreated from her eyes. She no longer flinched when he entered the room. They worked. They dug a path to the barn, their shoulders aching. They repaired the collapsed section of the chicken coop. They spoke of practical things, the level of the grain, the health of the cow, the need for more meat. One night, his parents long asleep in the alcove, they sat by the fire. The only sound was the hiss of the flames and the scrape of Beckett's knife against a piece of harness leather. Clara was patching one of her own thin stockings, her head bent, the firelight catching the brown and red tones in her hair. Beckett stopped his work. His hands, broad and scarred, rested on the leather. "They think I left them for the money," he said. Clara's needle paused. She did not look up, but her stillness was a form of listening. "The inheritance my uncle left." He stared into the fire, his voice low, grinding, as if pulling the words from somewhere deep and rusted. "They think I saw all that wealth and just rode away, that I abandoned them for it." He let out a breath, a bitter, self-mocking sound. "The money. God, I never wanted it. It was never the money." Clara finally looked at him. His face was hard in the firelight, his jaw set, his eyes fixed on something she could not see. "It was the land dispute," he said, his voice dropping further. "My cousins, they said the will was false. They came here from back east, not with lawyers. They came with questions and threats. We met in Sweetwater to settle it." He looked down at his own hands, splayed on his knees. "Elias, my cousin, we grew up hunting together back in Ohio. He pulled on me first. He was drunk, angry about the money he thought was his." Beckett's gaze was unflinching, but his voice was hollowed out by the memory. "I was faster. I shot him. He died in the street, right in front of the saloon." He swallowed, the sound loud in the quiet cabin. "The law called it a clean fight, self-defense, but I killed him. My own kin. Overland I never asked for and money I didn't want." He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, his face buried in his hands. I looked at my PA. He was so proud. My son, the landowner. And Ma, she was planning, and all I could see was Elias, lying in the dirt. His voice was muffled, raw with a guilt 5 years old. "I couldn't stay. I couldn't be their son. I couldn't touch that money. It was covered in blood. So I left. I left them with the ranch and a bank account I never touched. I just ran. I thought I was protecting them from what I am." The silence that followed was profound. Clara set her mending aside. She watched the powerful set of his shoulders, now slumped in a confession he had likely never spoken aloud. He was in exile, just as she was. His shame was blood. Hers was a lie, but both had cost them everything. She understood the coldness she had first seen in him. It was not cruelty. It was a wall built to contain a fire. Her hand lifted. It trembled in the air between them, her fingers outstretched. She wanted to touch his shoulder, to offer the simplest human comfort. She knew what it was to be judged, to be alone with a truth that choked you. But she stopped. Her hand hung in the air, a breath away from his coat, before she pulled it back into her own lap, clasping it tightly. It was not her place. She was still the stranger, the charity case. But she found her voice. It was soft, but steady. "Thank you," she said. He looked up, his face ravaged, his eyes questioning. "For telling me," she finished. "You are not the man your parents think you are." He held her gaze, and in that moment, the last of the ice between them cracked. He saw no judgment in her face, no fear, only a deep, quiet understanding. He gave a single, sharp nod, and turned back to the fire when the snow finally lifted, melting into a muddy, churning spring. The world outside returned. The sound of the river, now a raging torrent of gray water and broken ice, filled the air. The sky was a high, aching blue. Beckett spent a day in the barn, currying and tending to his horse, a large black gelding he called Shadow. It was the only animal on the ranch that looked truly well fed. Beckett had brought his own grain. He led the horse out into the muddy yard. Clara was hanging blankets on a line. The first time in months they could be aired. "You ever ride?" he asked. She turned, startled. "No, sir, I've never been on a horse." "It's time you learned," he said. It was not a question. He brought the horse over. Shadow was massive, his coat gleaming, his breath pluming. Clara backed away, intimidated. "He won't hurt you," Beckett said. "He's gentler than he looks." He cupped his hands. "Put your foot here." "I can't," she whispered. "I'll fall." "You won't fall," he said, his voice firm but patient. "I won't let you." She hesitated, looking at the man. Then the horse. She took a breath, gathered her worn skirts, and put her boot in his hands. He lifted her as if she weighed nothing, and she scrambled awkwardly into the saddle. She was perched high off the ground, her knuckles white as she gripped the saddle horn. He smiled. It was the first time she had seen it. It was a small, rusty expression, but it changed his entire face. "Just breathe," he said. "Feel him." He took the reins and began to lead the horse around the yard, his steps sure in the mud. He talked to her, his voice a low rumble, telling her about the horse, how to hold the reins, how to move with the animal. Not against it. At first, she was rigid, terrified, but the horse's gait was smooth, a powerful, rolling motion. The sun was warm on her face. She was looking out over the valley, over the tops of the fences. "You're doing it," he said, looking up at her. A strange, bubbling feeling rose in her chest. The fear gave way to something else, a wild, sudden joy. She let go of the horn with one hand, her balance uncertain, and then found it. "He's beautiful," she said, her voice full of wonder. "You can take the reins now," Beckett said. "Just hold them light. He knows what to do." He passed them to her. She was in control. She urged the horse into a slightly faster walk, her body learning the rhythm. She was moving. She was free. A sound escaped her. It was sharp and bright, a sound she did not recognize as her own. She was laughing. It was not a giggle, but a full, clear laugh that rang out in the quiet valley. Beckett stopped walking and just watched her. He had heard his mother weep and his father curse. He had heard Clara's terrified whispers and her delirious cries. But this sound, this was new. It was the sound of something unbroken. It struck him harder than any bullet, finding a place in his chest he had not known existed. He found himself smiling again, wider this time, and he did not feel the blood or the guilt. He only felt the sun. The days found a new rhythm. The tension that had been between them was still there, but it had changed. It was no longer the sharp edge of fear. It was the pull of a magnet, a warmth that arced between them in the small spaces of their lives. He took to watching her. He would pause in his work, mending a fence, and watch her feed the chickens, her movements quick and graceful. He watched her talk to his father, her head bent close, her voice patient. One evening, she stepped outside to the porch, thinking she was alone. The sky was a deep, velvet blue, pricked with 1,000,000 stars. The air was cold and clean. She unbound her hair, letting it fall from its tight bun. It was long, reaching her waist, a dark cascade in the moonlight. She took a brush from her pocket and began to draw it through the tangled lengths, a slow, repetitive motion. Beckett stood in the shadow of the barn, unmoving. He watched the pull of the brush, the way her hair fell like water over her shoulders. It was a private, womanly act, and he felt like a trespasser, but he could not look away. He had only ever seen her as a worker, bundled in rags, or as a patient, frail and sick. Now, he saw her as something else. She paused, as if sensing him. She turned her head, her hair falling over one shoulder. She saw him standing there in the dark. She did not startle. She did not run. She simply met his gaze, her hand frozen, the brush in her hair. The silence stretched, filled only by the distant river and the pounding of his heart. She held his gaze, her own wide and searching in the starlight. She did not look away. He helped her with the chores, their tasks now shared without discussion. One evening, after a long ride checking the property lines, they returned at dusk. He dismounted and turned to help her down from shadow. He put his hands on her waist, just as he had done before, but this time, when her feet touched the ground, he did not let go. She stood frozen, trapped between him and the horse. She could feel the solid heat of his palms through the thin fabric of her dress. She could smell the cold air on his coat, the scent of leather and pine. She tipped her head back to look at him. His face was close, his expression unreadable in the twilight. They stood there for a long moment, hardly breathing. The horse shifted, blowing out a soft breath. His left hand, which had been resting on her waist, slowly slid upward. It moved over her ribs, her back, until his broad palm rested flat between her shoulder blades, pulling her fractionally closer. She made a tiny sound, a soft gasp, but she did not move. She did not pull away. Her hands were on his shoulders, her fingers resting lightly on his coat. He was going to kiss her. She knew it. She saw his gaze drop to her mouth. A door slammed open. "Beckett? Clara? Is that you?" It was Elspeth's voice from the porch. The spell shattered. They sprang apart, breathless, as if surfacing from deep water. "We're here, Ma," Beckett called out, his voice thick. Clara hurried past him, her face burning, and disappeared into the house without a word. The storm that came was not snow, but a deluge of cold spring rain. It turned the yard back into a sea of mud and hammered on the new roof of the barn. Beckett and Clara were inside, checking on the cow, who was due to calf. The air in the barn was close, smelling of sweet hay, manure, and the damp earth. The rain on the roof was a deafening roar. They had barely spoken since the moment by the horse. The air between them was electric, dangerous. "She seems all right," Clara said, her voice too loud, straining to be heard over the thunder. She gave the cow a final pat. "I'll bring her some fresh water." "Clara." She turned. He was standing by the stall door, blocking her way. A flash of lightning lit the barn, painting his face in stark white and shadow. He looked tormented. Us," he said, gesturing between them. "I can't." He stepped toward her. She backed up until she hit the rough wood of the stall. "Mr. Hale," she whispered, her hands rising as if to ward him off. "Don't," he said, his voice rough. "Don't call me that." "Not anymore." He reached out, his calloused thumb touching her cheek. She flinched, her eyes closing, a memory of a different hand, a different touch, flashing through her, but his touch was not damp or cruel. It was rough, dry, and trembling. "Beckett," she breathed. That was all it took. He leaned in and kissed her. It was hesitant at first, a desperate, clumsy meeting of lips. It was the cold rain on his skin and the fear on hers, but then he deepened it, his hand moving to cradle the back of her head, his fingers tangling in the hair at her nape. She tasted of tea and wood smoke. A jolt went through her, electric and terrifying. She kissed him back. She clutched at his shirt, her body, so long starved of any kindness, responding with a fierce, sudden hunger. It was a kiss of loneliness, of shared exile, of the thunder outside and the storm inside. Then, just as quickly, she broke it. She pushed against his chest, her breath coming in ragged sobs. "No, I can't." "You don't understand." He tried to pull her back. "Clara, it's all right." "No," she cried, her voice breaking. "It's not. You don't know me. You don't know what I am." "I know you're the woman who saved my parents," he said, his hand still on her arms. "I'm the woman who was run out of town." She wept, the words finally tearing free. "I'm the preacher's shame. That's what they call me. Beckett, that's who you're kissing." He went still. "What? What did you say?" The story poured out of her, a torrent as wild as the rain. She told him about the laundry, about Silas Croft, the preacher's son. She told him about the damp smile, the hands on her wrist, the advances she had refused. He tore his own shirt. She choked, tears streaming down her face. He went to his father and said I seduced him, that I was a temptress, a Jezebel, and they believed him. Of course they believed him. He was the preacher's son, and I was nobody. She was shaking violently. I was shamed from the pulpit. No one would look at me. No one would sell me food. I was driven out. That's who I am. I'm soiled. Beckett. I'm what they said I am. Beckett was stunned into silence. He stared at her, at this small, trembling woman who had borne this brand alone. His face, which had been soft with passion, hardened into a cold, dangerous fury. But it was not directed at her. "He lied," Beckett said, his voice a low growl. "It doesn't matter," she sobbed. "It's what they believe. It matters to me." He took her face in his hands, forcing her to look at him. His eyes were blazing. "You have nothing to be ashamed of. Do you hear me, Clara? Nothing. But He is the one who should be ashamed, not you." He lowered his head. This kiss was nothing like the first. It was not hungry or desperate. It was a promise. It was reverence. He kissed her forehead, tasting the salt of her tears. He kissed her eyelids, her trembling cheeks. And then, so softly she almost didn't feel it, he kissed her mouth. "You have no shame," he whispered against her lips. "You are the strongest person I have ever known." He held her, simply held her, as she wept into his shirt, her body finally releasing months of terror and disgrace. The thunderstorm raged around them, but inside the barn, the only sound was her quiet, healing sobs. That night, she could not sleep. She lay on her cot, listening to the new sound of snow falling outside the window. The rain had turned, blanketing the world in white once more. She heard Beckett shift on his pallet by the dying fire. He was not asleep either. She rose. The floorboards were cold beneath her bare feet. She wore only her thin shift. He heard her and sat up. "Clara." She walked across the small space, her heart a drum against her ribs. She stopped in front of him. In the dim red glow of the embers, he could see she was trembling, but her eyes were fixed on his. This was not a plea. It was a choice. He understood. He rose to his knees, his expression full of a question she had to answer. He did not touch her. "This is not," she whispered, her voice rough, "because of shame, or because I'm grateful. This is for me." He nodded, his throat thick. "Clara," he said, his voice raw. He reached out, his hand hovering, not daring to touch. "Are you sure? Is this what you want?" She nodded, a single, sharp movement. He took her hand. His was hot, rough. Hers was cold. He led her not to his pallet, but to his old cot, the one she had occupied since his return. It was larger, softer. He pulled back the blankets. The air was freezing. He sat her on the bed and knelt before her, chafing her cold hands in his. He did not rush. He looked at her, his eyes asking permission at every step. He touched the frayed ribbon at the neck of her shift. He paused. She nodded again. He untied it. His movements were hesitant, almost clumsy for such a large man. He eased the thin fabric off her shoulders, his gaze reverent. He saw the sharp line of her collarbone, the hollows of her starvation, the pale, untouched skin. He pulled the blankets up, covering her instantly, shielding her from the cold and his own gaze. He shed his own shirt and trousers in the darkness and slid under the covers beside her. The cot was narrow, forcing them together. She was stiff, a line of cold terror, and he felt her recoil. He stopped. "I won't," he whispered, his voice aching. "I won't be him. Clara, I'll stop. Just say it." She turned, and the last of her fear broke. This was Beckett, the man who had read to her, the man who had called her strong. She moved, her cold body pressing against his warmth. "Don't stop," she whispered. It was emotional, raw, It was hesitant. His first touch was on her hair, pushing it back from her face. His next was a hand flat on her stomach, a simple, warm presence. He asked her, with his eyes, with his hands, with his whispered words. "Here? Is this all right?" And she, in turn, began to explore. Her small, shy hands touched his chest, his scarred shoulders, the rough hair. It was a discovery, a reclamation. When he finally came to her, it was with a gentleness that bordered on pain, a desperate bid to heal what another man had broken. It was not a taking. It was a finding. Afterward, they lay tangled, their breath mingling in the cold. He held her, his arm a heavy, protective bar over her waist, her head tucked under his chin. He was overwhelmed by a fierce, protective tenderness he had not known he possessed. She felt safe. The word was so foreign. She barely recognized the feeling, but it was there. She was home, outside the single window. The snow fell thick and silent, covering the mud and the tracks, burying the cabin once more, sealing them in a world that, for tonight, belonged only to them. Hope was a terrifying thing. It felt like thin ice over a deep, black river. Clara had spent her whole life learning not to walk on it, but in the days that followed the storm, she felt it crackling beneath her feet. She woke up in Beckett's cot. He had insisted, taking the cold pallet by the door, and the first thing she saw was him, already stoking the fire, his broad back a wall of solid protection. He was different. The silence that had once been a wall of ice between them was now a shared, comfortable space. He spoke more, not in long speeches, but in small observations. "Sky looks clear today. The cow's looking better." And he looked at her. He looked at her when she was kneading dough, when she was reading to his mother, when she was just staring into the fire. It was a look of quiet possession, a warmth that made her blush and, at the same time, terrified her. He touched her. It was never improper, but it was constant, a hand on the small of her back as he passed her in the narrow space, his fingers brushing hers as he handed her a mug of coffee, a solid, warm presence at her side when they walked to the barn. She lived for those small, grounding touches, and she waited, every minute, for them to stop. The thaw was coming in earnest now. The world was a mess of mud and melting snow. The river roared, a constant, angry sound in the valley. They were outside, trying to repair a section of fence that had been flattened by the winter. Clara was holding a post steady while Beckett tamped the wet earth around it. "When spring proper comes," he said, his voice gruff, not looking at her. "When the road to Cheyenne is clear, I want you to stay." Clara's heart stopped. She had been holding her breath for this, and now that it was here, she felt nothing but a cold rush of panic. He meant it, now. He meant it while they were here, trapped on this muddy patch of land, with the world held at bay. But the world was not going to stay at bay. She said nothing. She could not. To say yes felt like a lie, a promise she could not keep. To say no felt like tearing her own heart out. "Did you hear me, Clara?" he asked, finally looking up. She could not meet his eyes. She stared at the rusted wire in her hands. "The wire is broken here," she said, her voice small, dead. "It will need mending." He saw her retreat. He saw the wall go up, the one he had worked so hard to tear down. He stood, his frustration a visible thing, wiping his muddy hands on his trousers. "This has nothing to do with the wire." "He'll find me," she whispered, the truth finally coming out. "He won't just let this go, and when he comes, he'll tell you. He'll tell everyone, and you." She finally looked at him, her eyes wide with a fear that was all for him. "You're a rich man, Beckett. You have a name. You can't tie yourself to me, to the preacher's shame." "I thought we were past that," he said, his voice hard. "You are," she said, "but the world is not." "Spring is coming, Beckett. That means the town is coming. They will not let you be happy with me." Before he could answer, his mother's voice called from the porch. The conversation was over. the fence post left unsecured in the mud. Clara secretly believed it was a fool's errand. She believed he would change his mind as soon as he saw her through the town's eyes. This was just a fever dream. Born of the snow and the silence, it would not survive the thaw. But his parents saw it differently. Jedediah was quieter. His gruff complaints softened. He would ask Clara to sit by him, to describe the valley as the snow melted, and he would nod, as if her voice was all the sight he needed. Elspeth was more direct. One afternoon, while Beckett was out checking his traps by the river, she motioned Clara to her bedside. The cabin was quiet, filled with the flat, gray light of afternoon. Elspeth's papery hand fumbled for hers, the milky eyes searching Clara's face. "Clara, child," she whispered, her voice reedy. "Yes, ma'am." Clara knelt by the bed, her hands still damp from washing the lunch dishes. He's different." Elspeth's fingers tightened on hers. "My boy, I thought he was gone for good. That money, and that terrible business with Elias, it put a poison in him. He was a good boy, always. But he came back from that fight, a hard man, a cold man, and then he left." Tears welled in the old woman's clouded eyes. "I prayed for 5 years. I prayed for my son to come home, but he didn't." She squeezed Clara's hand, her grip surprisingly strong. I think I was praying for the wrong thing. He didn't come back for us. Child, we were just the excuse. He came back, and he found you. You're the reason he's staying. You're the reason his voice is soft again. You brought him back. Clara, you're the reason he came back." A cold dread, mingled with a profound, aching gratitude, filled Clara. It was too much. It was a burden she could not bear. What if she was not the reason he stayed, but the reason he was ruined? She was a walking disgrace, and Elspeth was praising her like a savior. I just did what anyone would," Clara stammered, pulling her hand away gently. "No, child," Elspeth said, settling back, a small, knowing smile on her face. "You did what you did, and it was enough." Trouble arrived 2 days later. The road to Sweetwater was finally clear, a long, ugly scar of mud. Clara was hanging blankets on the line, the sun warm for the first time. When she saw him, a single rider, picking his way through the mud, it was not Beckett. Her blood turned to ice water. She dropped the blanket in the mud. Silas. He had found her. She ran. She burst into the cabin, her breath ragged. "Someone's coming! A rider!" Beckett was oiling his rifle. He looked up, his eyes instantly sharp, seeing the pure animal terror on her face. "Who?" "I don't know. He's coming from the road." She fled to the alcove, pulling the thin calico curtain shut, her body trembling so violently her teeth chattered. She was trapped. Beckett took the rifle, his movements economical and deadly. He stepped onto the porch just as the rider was dismounting. It was not Silas. It was August Reed, their neighbor. "August," Beckett said, his voice tight, the rifle held loose at his side. "Beckett, my God, son, you're home." August looked exhausted, his face grim. We thought your folks were dead." "They're fine," Beckett said, his eyes scanning the road behind the man. "We're fine. What is it? You look like you've seen a ghost." "I'm here about the woman, Beckett." August gestured to the house. "The one who's been staying here, Clara Middleton." Behind the curtain, Clara pressed her hands to her mouth to stop her sob. Beckett's stance hardened. "What about her?" "There's trouble," August said, twisting his hat in his hands. "Big trouble. Men came through Sweetwater 2 days ago. They were led by Silas Croft, the preacher's son." Beckett's face was stone. "Go on." "He's claiming she's his promised bride. Beckett says she ran out on him. And he's saying she's a thief. He's got papers. He's claiming she stole near $50 in silver from the church collection fund." Beckett's voice was dangerously low. "He's a liar." "I reckon so," August said, clearly miserable. "I've seen the girl in town. She don't look the type. But he's got the law on his side. Son, he's got Sheriff Brody. They've been waiting for the road to clear. They're planning to ride out here tomorrow to arrest her." August finally looked up, his eyes full of pity. "I came to warn you. They're saying you've been keeping her, that you're complicit. Brody's just looking for a reason to stir up trouble for you. Beckett, ever since the Elias business, you need to get her out of here. For your own sake." August mounted his horse. "I've said my piece. I'll see you. Beckett, be careful." The sound of the horse's retreating hooves was swallowed by the roar of the river. Beckett stood on the porch for a long minute. Then he turned and went inside. He pushed back the curtain. Clara was huddled on the floor, her face buried in her knees, rocking back and forth. She was a small, broken thing. "You have to let me go," she whispered, her voice choked. "I have to leave. Tonight, I'll go north. They'll never find me." "No," Beckett said. She looked up, her face streaked with tears, her eyes wild. "You don't understand. He'll ruin you. This is what I was afraid of. He'll tell everyone I'm a thief, a whore. He'll drag your name. This ranch, your parents, all of it. Down with me." She grabbed his shirt, her voice rising to a desperate plea. "You killed a man. Beckett. They hate you in that town. They're just waiting for a reason to arrest you again. I won't be that reason. I won't." He gripped her arms, his fingers biting into her skin, and hauled her to her feet. "Stop it. I am not letting you run from this. We are not running." "What? What are you doing?" "We're riding to town now." "No!" she shrieked, fighting him. "No, Beckett, please, I can't. Don't make me. They'll all be there." "You're done hiding, Clara," he said, his voice a low, furious growl. "And I'm done running." The ride to Sweetwater was a nightmare. Clara was so terrified she felt sick, her body rigid on the horse. Beckett was a thundercloud of controlled rage, his face set, his hand never far from the pistol on his hip. The town was a long, muddy street between false-fronted buildings. And just as she had feared, everyone was out. It was as if they had been waiting. As they rode down the main street, conversation stopped. Men on the boardwalk stopped whittling. Women sweeping their porches paused, their hands on their brooms. Mrs. Gable, the mercantile owner's wife, stood with her arms crossed. "Well, look at that," she said, her voice carrying clearly in the quiet. The preacher's shame found herself a new benefactor, and a rich one, this time. A group of men outside the saloon stopped. Their gazes were not just curious, they were leering. They looked at Clara, then at Beckett. "Hale's got himself astray." "Has he?" one of them called out. "Taming her out on the ranch? Beckett!" Clara felt the heat on her face, a wave of pure, agonizing humiliation. She shrank, wishing she could disappear. Beckett stopped his horse. He dismounted, then turned and lifted her down. His hands were hard on her waist. He did not release her. He kept one hand on the small of her back, a solid, proprietary gesture, and steered her toward the sheriff's office. He was daring them. He was telling the whole town, "She is with me." The sheriff's office was small, smelling of stale tobacco and dust. Sheriff Brody, a big man with a tarnished star and cold eyes, looked up from his desk. "Hale," he said, not bothering to stand. "Wasn't expecting you. Heard you were back." "I hear you're looking for Miss Middleton," Beckett said, his voice flat. Brody spat a stream of brown juice into a spittoon. "I am, and so is Mr. Croft. He's here, as a matter of fact." Silas Croft stepped out from a back room, and Clara's heart stopped. He was just as she remembered. Handsome, his black suit clean, his collar white, his smile slick and damp. His eyes, however, glittered with a cold, triumphant fire when he saw her. "Clara, my dear," he said, his voice full of false concern. "You ran off and worried us all sick. Thank heaven you're safe." "Stay away from me," Clara whispered, her voice trembling as she instinctively moved behind Beckett. Beckett stepped in front of her. A solid wall. "She's not your dear, and she's not going anywhere with you." Silas's face tightened, the mask of concern slipping. "Now, Mr. Hale, I don't want any trouble, but this woman is my promised bride." She's not, Beckett said. She is, Silas insisted. And she's not in her right mind. She's been corrupted. I fear you've taken advantage of her, sir. Sheriff Brody stood, pulling a piece of paper from his desk. This here is a legal claim. Hale, a marriage agreement, signed in triplicate, signed by Miss Clara Middleton, promising her hand to Mr. Silas Croft. I never signed that, Clara cried from behind Beckett. I never did. It's a forgery, Beckett said, his hand moving to rest on the butt of his pistol. Brody ignored him. And there's this, an accusation of moral corruption filed by Preacher Croft himself, and a charge of theft, $50, from the church poor box. She's a fallen woman. Sheriff, Silas said, his voice pious, directed at Beckett. I was only trying to save her soul. And she repaid my kindness with thievery and slander. You're a liar and a coward, Croft, Beckett growled. The argument, and the players, spilled out onto the boardwalk. A crowd had gathered, drawn by the sight of Beckett Hale's horse and the promise of a confrontation. They were a ring of hostile, whispering faces. This woman, Beckett announced, his voice ringing out, has been at my ranch for 6 months. She's been nursing my blind father and my sick mother. She's no thief, and she is sure as hell not this snake's bride. Silas smiled, seeing his advantage. He addressed the crowd. See, he admits it. He's been keeping her, hiding her, living in sin with this woman. Just as I said, she's a temptress. She lured him, just as she tried to lure me. A woman in a gray bonnet in the crowd gasped. Shame! Clara stood, frozen, her humiliation complete. Tears of helpless rage and shame streamed down her face. A grimy ranch hand, drunk, shoved his way to the front of the crowd. He looked Clara up and down, a filthy, appreciative look. Looks like she's everyone's woman, for a price. He grinned, then leaned forward and spat. The thick, brown gob of tobacco juice landed on the hem of Clara's ragged skirt. Time stopped. The whispers, the traffic, the wind. It all stopped. Clara looked down at the stain, a fresh mark of her defilement. Beckett, who had been vibrating with a rage he was barely holding in, went absolutely still. He turned, his eyes flat and dead. He moved so fast, no one saw the punch. They only heard the sickening crack of bone as his fist connected with the man's jaw. The ranch hand flew backward, his arms windmilling, and crashed into the horse trough, sending a spray of dirty water into the air. The crowd exploded. Brawl! He hit him! 2 of the man's friends, yelling, jumped Beckett. It was not a fight. It was a storm. Beckett was not the quiet nurse from the cabin. He was the man who had killed Elias. He was pure, focused violence. He broke one man's nose with his elbow. He grabbed the other and threw him bodily through the front window of the Mercantile. Glass shattered. Women screamed. Clara watched in pure terror. Beckett, stop! Please stop! Don't! Sheriff Brody, his face purple, drew his pistol and fired it into the air. Hale, that's enough! That's it! You're under arrest! Assault! Destruction of property! This was it. Her nightmare. She had done it. She had ruined him. She had gotten him arrested. Beckett stood in the center of the street, breathing hard, his knuckles split and bleeding. The 2 men were groaning on the ground. He looked at Brody's gun, then at Silas, who was watching with a smirk. I'm taking you in. Hale, Brody said, walking toward him. Pistol level? No, Beckett said. His voice was calm, deadly. You're not... He took a step toward Silas, who flinched. This is a lie. That paper is a forgery. You know it. I know it. He looked at Brody. I'll be back tomorrow, with a lawyer from Cheyenne. A real one. And if you try to serve that paper, or if you take 1 step toward my ranch. He let the threat hang in the air. I'll finish what I started with my cousin, and you all know I will. He turned, grabbed Clara's arm, and pulled her through the stunned, silent crowd. He shoved her onto her horse, mounted his, and they rode out of town, leaving the whispers, the broken glass, and the smell of fear behind them. The ride back was a long, terrible silence. Clara was crying, a hopeless, racking sound that tore at his nerves. Beckett was grim, his face a mask of stone, his bleeding knuckles gripping the reins. They reached the ranch well after dark. Elspeth met them at the door, her face a knot of worry. "What happened? My lands! Beckett, your hand! It's bleeding!" "It's nothing, Ma," Beckett bit out, pushing past her. He went straight to the small shelf, grabbed the bottle of whiskey, and pulled the cork with his teeth. Clara fled. She ran to her cot in the corner, buried her face in the thin pillow, and let the sobs tear her apart. She had destroyed him. It was over. She had brought the filth of the town to his home, and now he was a marked man again. All because of her. Late that night, the house was dark. His parents were asleep, their breathing the only sound. Beckett had fallen into a drunken, restless sleep in his chair by the hearth, the whiskey bottle half empty on the floor beside him. Clara rose. She moved with a silence born of a lifetime of fear. She put on her ragged coat. She picked up her small bundle, which held nothing. She found a scrap of wrapping paper and a piece of charcoal from the fire. Her hand was shaking, but she wrote, "I'm sorry. Don't look for me. I will not ruin you." She laid it on the table. She opened the door. The world was white. A late, silent snow was falling, thick and heavy, as if spring had given up. It was cold. She stepped out. Her boots made no sound in the fresh powder. She looked back at the cabin, a dark shape of warmth and hope she had to leave. Then she turned and ran. She ran toward the dark line of the river, toward the road, anywhere. The rush of cold air woke Beckett. He jerked awake, his head thick. The door was open. Snow was blowing onto the floor. "Clara?" He was on his feet, his mind instantly, terrifyingly clear. He saw the bundle gone. He saw the note on the table. A raw, primal sound tore from his chest. "No!" He burst out of the cabin, coatless, bootless, into the freezing night. The snow was up to his shins. "Clara!" He saw her, a small, dark shape, running across the white field, already halfway to the trees. He ran through the snow, his feet burning, his heart exploding. He was faster. He reached her just as she natooks in the tree line. He did not slow down. He tackled her, his arms wrapping around her waist, bringing them both down in a deep drift of snow. She fought him, her fists hitting his chest, her voice a hysterical, broken scream. "Let me go! Let me go! I'm poison! I'm filth! I'm ruining you! Let me die out here! Let me go!" He held her, rolling, his face buried in her snow-caked hair. He was yelling, pleading, his voice breaking. "Stop! God, Clara, just stop fighting me!" "You'll be arrested," she sobbed, hitting his bare chest. "You'll go to jail, because of me, because of what I am." "I don't care," he roared, his voice raw with a pain that had nothing to do with the brawl, or his past, or the cold. "Do you hear me? I don't care about the town. I don't care about the sheriff, or that liar, or his forged papers." He grabbed her, pulling her up out of the snow, gripping her shoulders, shaking her, forcing her to look at him. His face was a mask of desperation, snow melting in his hair, tears freezing on his cheeks. "I was dead, Clara," he yelled. "For 5 years, I was a walking ghost. I came home to bury my parents. I was going to drink myself to death in this cabin, and I found you." The words tore out of him. "You were here. You were keeping them alive. You were life. You saved them. And then you saved me. You saved me." "Beckett," she whispered, her fight gone, her body gone limp. "I love you." He broke down, the words finally, irrevocably spoken. "God help me. Clara, I love you. I won't let them shame you anymore. I won't let you run. You are not leaving me. I will not let you." She stared at him, her sobs catching in her throat. This was not the hard man from the brawl. This was not the cold man who had returned. This was hers. He was not angry. He was terrified. Terrified of losing her. She collapsed against him, her arms wrapping around his neck, her face pressing into his cold, wet skin. I love you too, she wept. I'm so afraid. I know, he whispered, his arms crushing her to him. So am I. He stood, lifting her as if she weighed nothing. He carried her back to the house, his feet numb, leaving a trail of blood from his cut knuckles in the snow. He kicked the door shut against the storm. He did not take her to her cot. He did not pause. He crossed to his own narrow bed by the fire, laying her down and following, pulling the rough blankets over both of them, his wet, freezing clothes and all. He kissed her. It was not hesitant. It was not reverent. It was desperate. It was the taste of salt and snow, of whiskey and blood. It was two people, broken and shamed, clinging to each other in a storm, refusing to be pulled apart. This time, there were no questions asked, no permissions sought. There was no fear of touch, only the agonizing, unbearable fear of separation. It was a raw, claiming act. It was not about healing. It was about belonging. She met his desperation with her own, her hands raking through his hair, her body arching against his, claiming him just as he was claiming her. This was not a choice made in fear. It was a desperate, defiant stand. They fell asleep, tangled in the narrow cot, their wet clothes steaming in the warmth of the fire as the snow fell silently outside, a white, cleansing blanket over the dark, wounded earth. Beckett Hale woke to the thin, cold light of dawn. He woke not from sleep, but from a watchful daze, his arms still locked around Clara, his body a shield over hers in the narrow cot. The snow had stopped. The world outside was muffled, pure and white, but inside, the truce was over. The fight had come to them, and now he would take the fight to his enemy. He was a changed man. The 5 years of guilt-ridden drifting had been burned away in the snow, in her fear, in his own terrible, protective rage. The wealth he had despised, the inheritance that had felt like a bloodstain, was now a tool. It was a weapon, and he intended to wield it. Clara was still sleeping, her face pale and exhausted in the gray light, dark smudges under her closed eyes. He eased himself out of the cot, his feet hitting the cold floorboards. He moved with purpose, building the fire, setting the coffee to boil. He did not look at the whiskey bottle, but kicked it aside. He sat at the table and wrote. He wrote to a man named Josiah Finch, a lawyer in Cheyenne, a man whose reputation was as sharp and unforgiving as a barbed wire fence. Finch was expensive, and he was not kind, but he was loyal to Hale money. Beckett explained the situation in curt, clear sentences: a forged marriage contract, slander, theft allegations, and a corrupt local sheriff. He included a bank draft for a staggering sum, $500, and a promise of $500 more on resolution. When August Reed rode by later that morning, checking on them after the brawl in town, Beckett met him in the yard. He handed the older man the sealed packet and another bank draft. "August," he said, his voice flat, "I need this taken to the telegraph office in Cheyenne. Today, the draft is for your trouble." August looked at the packet, then at Beckett's hard, set face and the fresh, raw knuckles on his right hand. He nodded slowly. "This is about Croft. This is about my property," Beckett said, his gaze fixed on the town's direction. "And Miss Middleton is on my property." The wires began to hum. Josiah Finch moved with the speed of a striking rattlesnake. He dispatched a private investigator, a quiet man in a bowler hat, who arrived in Sweetwater and spent 3 days drinking quietly in the saloon. Listening, he sent a clerk to the land office, who, with the help of a hefty bribe, another draft from Beckett, procured a copy of the marriage contract. Finch's handwriting expert in Denver needed only 1 day. The signature on the contract, when compared to the parish laundry receipts Clara had signed for 6 months, was a forgery, and not a good one. Silas, in his arrogance, had tried to mimic her hand, but his own flourished, egotistical loops gave him away. Finch then sent a carefully worded letter to Sheriff Brody, with a copy to Preacher Croft. It mentioned federal mail fraud for the forged document, conspiracy, and the legal ramifications of slander against a prominent landowner's associate It promised a lawsuit that would not only bankrupt the church, but would likely see the sheriff investigated for corruption by the territorial government. The threat was clear. The hail money, which had been dormant for 5 years, was now in play. While the legal gears turned, life on the ranch transformed. Clara was no longer a shadow. The fear of being driven out was gone, replaced by the terror of what was coming. But that terror, and the defiant stand in the snow, had forged something new in her. She had a place. She had a defender. She was no longer a victim. She worked, not as a servant, but as a partner. She rose with Beckett, their hands brushing as they reached for the coffee pot. A silent acknowledgement of the night before. They moved in a shared rhythm. He would be splitting wood, and she would be there, stacking it, her small, capable hands keeping pace with his. "You'll hurt your back," he'd grumble, trying to take a heavy log from her. "I've been lifting wet laundry heavier than this my whole life. Beckett," she'd say, her voice steady. "I'm not made of glass." He began to truly see her strength. It was not just the quiet endurance he had first witnessed. It was a steel wire that ran through her. He taught her to properly handle the horses, and the fear she'd once had was replaced by a firm, gentle command. She had good hands, he noted, sensitive and sure. She helped him train a young filly, her voice calm and soothing, succeeding where his own impatient strength had failed. She cooked, but it was no longer the thin, desperate broth of a siege. Beckett had ridden out and shot a deer, and the cabin was filled with the rich smell of roasting meat. She was feeding their home, and the color returned to her cheeks. She was still thin, but she was no longer frail. She was vital. One Sunday, nearly 2 weeks after the fight, August Reed rode over again, this time with a flyer. "Tent revival," he announced. "Down in the flats, a traveling preacher, man named Brother Gideon. Seems the whole valley's going." Clara looked at the flyer. Preacher Croft's church in Sweetwater was the only one for 50 miles. This revival, out in the open, was neutral ground. "I want to go," she said. Beckett looked at her, startled. "To town? After what happened?" "It's not in town. It's on the flats," she said, her hands twisting in her apron. "I'm tired of hiding, Beckett. I'm tired of being a ghost. They all whisper about me. I want them to see me. I want to say my piece." He argued. It was dangerous. Silas would be there. Brody. But she was immovable. He saw the new, hard light in her eyes. "You said you wouldn't let them shame me anymore," she said. "That starts with me not letting them." He relented, his heart a cold knot of apprehension. The revival was a massive canvas tent, lit by sputtering torches that threw wild, leaping shadows. Half the county was there, bundled in coats against the evening chill, their faces pale and eager in the flickering light. Mrs. Gable was there, and the mercantile owner. Beckett saw the families of the men he had beaten in the brawl, their eyes cold and hateful. He felt their stares as he and Clara entered, but he kept his hand on the small of her back, steering her to a bench near the front. He stood behind her, a solid, unmoving sentinel. Silas and Preacher Croft were not there. They were, it seemed, too proud to attend another preacher's meeting. Brother Gideon was a force of nature, a big, bearded man with a voice like a landslide. He preached of sin, of the serpent in the garden, of the wickedness of the human heart. He spoke of liars and thieves, of bearing false witness, and of the harlot who defiled the righteous. With every word, Clara felt the eyes of the crowd on her. She felt their judgment, their certainty of her guilt. The preacher finished, calling for sinners to come forward, to confess, to be saved. The air was thick with the sound of weeping and hymns. Then Clara stood up. The music faltered. The weeping stopped. A deep, shocked hush fell over the tent. She walked, her boots making a soft, solitary sound on the bare earth, until she stood in the open space before the preacher. She was trembling, but she held her head high. "Preacher," she said, her voice clear, carrying to every corner of the tent. It was not the whisper of a servant. It was the voice of a woman. Brother Gideon, surprised, looked down at her. "Yes, sister. Have you come to confess?" "I have come," Clara said, "to speak a truth. You talk of bearing false witness. For 6 months, this valley has borne false witness against me." A gasp went through the crowd. "Mrs." Gable's mouth fell open. "My name is Clara Middleton. I was the laundress for the church in Sweetwater. I was accused of being a temptress, of being a thief, by Silas Croft, the preacher's son." "Sister, this is not the place," Brother Gideon began, his face darkening. "This is the only place," Clara interrupted, her voice gaining strength. "He lied. He made advances, and I refused him. He tore his own shirt, and he lied to his father. And that church, his church, branded me a harlot and drove me out with no food, no money, and nowhere to go." She turned, her gaze sweeping the stunned, silent faces of the townspeople. "You all believed him. You whispered. You called me the preacher's shame. You looked away when I tried to buy bread." She turned back to the preacher. "You speak of sin. The sin is not mine. The sin belongs to Silas Croft, and it belongs to a church that protects a liar and condemns an innocent woman. I am no thief. I am no harlot. I am a woman who refused to be assaulted." She looked at him, her eyes burning. "I demand that you, as a man of God, denounce that lie. I demand that you tell your congregation what true sin looks like." Brother Gideon was speechless. He was a man of fire and brimstone, but he was not prepared for this. He saw the small, defiant woman. He saw the hard, wealthy, and very dangerous man standing behind her, his hand never leaving his gun. And he saw the faces of the crowd, their certainty shaken for the first time. "Sister," he stammered, "all sinners can be redeemed." "Perhaps you mistook the young man's intentions." "I mistook nothing," Clara said, her voice cold. "He is a liar, and God knows it, even if you will not say it." She turned, her back straight, and walked out of the tent. Beckett followed, a dark shadow at her heels. Behind them, the revival did not resume. It collapsed into 100 furious, uncertain whispers. For the first time, the whispers were not all against her. Some, for the first time, were for her. The ride home was silent. Clara was shaking, the adrenaline leaving her weak. When they got to the cabin, Beckett poured her a cup of water, his hand unsteady. "That was," he said, "the bravest damn thing I've ever seen." She sat by the fire, shivering, and he put his sheepskin coat around her shoulders. The confrontation had cracked open the last of her defenses. She felt raw, exposed, but also free. "He won't stop. Beckett," she whispered, staring into the flames. "A man like that, he can't be humiliated. He'll come here. Let him come," Beckett said. She looked at him, at his strong, kind face, and knew she had to tell him. All of it. The truth she had kept locked away even from him. "You don't know the worst of it," she said, her voice barely audible. "You defended me, but you don't know what I really am, where I really came from." He sat on the stool opposite her, his expression patient. "Then tell me. My mother, I don't remember her. My father, I don't know. I was left in a house in Laramie, a boarding house for young women. It was run by a woman they told me to call Aunt." Beckett's face tightened, but he said nothing. "I worked," Clara continued, her eyes fixed on the fire, her voice dead. "I scrubbed floors, washed linens, the same as always. But I saw things, I heard things. The men who came, the way the other girls, the way they lived." Her breath hitched. "When I was 15, my aunt told me I was old enough to stop washing the linens and start earning my keep, like the others." She closed her eyes, the memory a suffocating, filthy thing. "She bought me a red dress. She told me a man was coming, a special friend. I knew what it meant. I packed a loaf of bread and the $2 I had saved, and I climbed out the window. I ran." She took a shuddering breath. "I've been running ever since, from town to town, always the laundress, always invisible, because I knew if anyone ever found out where I came from, they would see me as spoiled, as ruined, as no better than a common prostitute. That's why Silas thought he could just take me. He must have known. Someone must have told him. He knew I was nobody. He knew no one would believe me. She finally looked at him, her eyes swimming in unshed tears. That's who you're protecting. Beckett, a girl who ran away from a brothel. A girl who was one step away from being that. She choked on the word. I never, ever thought I would be loved. Not by a decent man, not by anyone. Beckett sat in silence for a long time, his expression unreadable. Clara's heart sank. This was it. This was the truth that would finally make him turn away. He reached out and took her hand. His was rough, calloused, and warm. She had not realized how cold hers had become. Clara, he said, his voice quiet but fierce. I don't care about a perfect past. I don't want a woman who's never seen the ugly side of the world. I've seen it. I've been the ugly side of the world. He squeezed her hand. You were a child. You were left in hell. And you climbed out the window. A look of profound, aching respect filled his eyes. You ran. You survived. You stayed clean. You kept yourself whole. He knelt in front of her, his other hand coming up to cup her face. Your story doesn't scare me. Clara, it doesn't shame me. It makes me... God, I don't even have the words. Do not, ever again, think you are not worthy of love. You are the only thing in this whole, damned valley that is. He kissed her, a deep, sealing kiss. It was not a kiss of passion, but of absolute acceptance. It was a vow. The confrontation came 3 days later. The air was clear and cold. Beckett was in the corral, working with the filly. Clara was on the top rail, watching. A small, genuine smile on her face. His parents were sitting on the porch, enjoying the weak sun. It was a moment of peace so perfect. It was bound to be broken. 4 riders appeared on the ridge. Clara's smile vanished. Beckett. He looked. His face went flat. Silas Croft. He was with 3 men, hard cases Beckett recognized from the Sweetwater Saloon. They rode into the yard, their horses fanning out. A clear, practiced threat. Beckett walked out of the corral, placing himself between the riders and the cabin. Clara jumped down from the rail and came to stand at his side. She was trembling, but she did not run. Croft, Beckett said, his voice deceptively calm. I thought I told you to stay off my land. Silas sneered. He had a bandage over his nose, a purple, ugly reminder of a punch he hadn't received, but one his friends had. He had been humiliated at the revival, and his legal claim was crumbling. This was no longer about a bride. This was about revenge. You don't give me orders. Hail, Silas spat. I'm here for what's mine. I'm here for the thief and the $50 she stole. She stole nothing, Beckett said. And she is mine. Now get out. Or what? Silas taunted. You'll hit me? You'll face me, man to man, or will you just hide behind your money and your fancy lawyers? He nodded to one of his men, a big, grimy man with a pistol tied low on his thigh. Go get her. Jeb. The man, Jeb, grinned, showing broken teeth. He swung off his horse and started walking toward Clara, his hand on his gun. That's far enough, Beckett said. Jeb kept coming. Beckett drew his pistol. It was not a fast draw, but it was smooth, cold, and final. The click of the hammer pulling back echoed in the yard. I won't tell you again. Jeb stopped, his grin fading. Silas, his face contorted with rage, yanked his own pistol from his coat. You'll shoot him? For her? You'll die for that whore. Hail. He leveled the gun, his hand shaking, not at the hired man, but at Beckett's chest. It happened in a heartbeat. Before Beckett could shift his aim from Jeb to Silas, Clara moved. She didn't hesitate. She threw herself in front of Beckett, her arms spread wide, her small body a shield. She was staring straight at Silas, her face white, her eyes blazing with a fire that eclipsed his. "No!" she screamed. "You'll have to shoot me first." The yard went dead silent. The only sound was the wind, whistling under the porch eaves, and Jedediah's sharp, terrified gasp from the cabin. Silas froze. His finger was on the trigger. He stared at her. This was not the terrified girl from the laundry. This was not the weeping victim. This was a stranger, a creature of pure, defiant will. He had come here to reclaim a cowering, shamed woman, but that woman was gone. He looked at her, then at Beckett, whose gun was now aimed steadily at his heart. He looked at his hired men, who had not signed on for a double murder, especially one that would bring the full weight of the Hale fortune and a Cheyenne lawyer down on their heads. They were already looking at their horses, their nerve broken. Silas's power had always come from her fear, and she was not afraid of him anymore. His face, a mask of righteous fury, crumpled into the petulant, ugly lines of a spoiled child. He lowered his gun. "She's not worth the bullet," he spat. The words aimed at Beckett, but meant for her. "She's all yours. Hale, you can have the town's trash." He wrenched his horse's head around, his spurs digging cruelly. He galloped out of the yard, his hired men scrambling to follow. A retreating cloud of dust and humiliation. Clara's knees gave out. She sagged, her breath leaving her in a long, shuddering sigh. Beckett caught her. His gun was already holstered. He wrapped his arms around her, holding her up, his face buried in her hair. He was shaking, his heart hammering against her back. You crazy, foolish," he whispered, his voice thick, choking. "He could have, He didn't," she whispered back, clinging to him. "It's over, Beckett, it's finally over." Spring did not just arrive, it burst. The final, late snow melted in a single week, and the valley floor, saturated and rich, erupted in a riot of green. The gray-brown world became a carpet of new grass, dotted with the bright yellow of mule's ear and the pale purple of spring beauties. The air was soft, carrying the smell of damp earth and cottonwood buds. The river, which had been a frozen scar and then an angry torrent, settled into a wide, placid flow, its voice a constant, reassuring murmur. On the high ridges, the last of the snow retreated, and in the barn, the bony old cow finally gave birth to a healthy calf. New lambs, their legs thin and wobbly, appeared in August Reed's flock across the valley. Life, which had been holding its breath all winter, had returned. The news of the standoff at the Hale Ranch had traveled faster than any telegraph. It became the new story, eclipsing the old one. Silas Croft and his hired men had ridden back to town in humiliated silence, and the story they told was not the one they had intended. They spoke of Clara's defiance, of Beckett's cold fury, and of the forged paper that a Cheyenne lawyer was now investigating. Sheriff Brody, faced with a direct threat from Josiah Finch and the undeniable shift in public opinion, quietly dropped all charges against Beckett. The assault on the drunk in the street was reclassified as a justifiable response to an insult. The destruction of property was paid for by Beckett, a sum of $20 in gold that silenced the mercantile owner completely. Silas Croft, facing a federal investigation and the sudden, cold shoulder of his own father's congregation, disappeared. He left Sweetwater in the night, just as Clara once had. But he was not driven out by shame. He was driven out by the truth. The town, which had once been a unified wall of condemnation, was now a fractured, uncertain thing. The whispers did not stop, but they changed their tune. Mrs. Gable, seeing which way the wind was blowing, and knowing the Hale money was back in play, was the first to wave. It was a stiff, awkward gesture as Clara and Beckett rode past the mercantile, but it was a wave. Then came the invitation. It was delivered by Brother Gideon, the traveling preacher, who rode out to the ranch himself, his hat in his hands. He found Clara not hiding in the cabin, but in the corral, her sleeve rolled up, helping Beckett gentle the filly. "Miss Middleton," he said, his voice humbled. He did not look at Beckett. who stood watching him, his arms crossed, a silent, intimidating presence. I have been speaking with some of the good women of Sweetwater, Mrs. Reed and others. That night at the revival, you spoke a hard truth, child, and it convicted us." He cleared his throat. "We are, that is to say, they are, starting a school for the girls. We've got 3 new orphans from the last fever, and a half-dozen others running wild. They need a woman to teach them. A woman who is strong. A woman who understands what it is to be without protection." Clara stared at him, her hands, sticky with horse sweat, gripping the rail. "A school? Just reading, and sums, and sewing," he said quickly. "Mrs. Reed suggested you. She said you had a good hand and a clearer voice than any of them. They would be honored if you would help, just 2 days a week." She looked at Beckett. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. She was not his property. She was her own woman. This was her choice. She turned back to the preacher, the girl who had been shamed from a church, who had been called filth, was now being asked to teach children. The ice around her heart, the last of the winter, finally broke and washed away. "I would be honored," she said, her voice thick. The community was changing. She was no longer the preacher's shame, in the quiet, grudging way of the West. She was becoming Hale's woman, and, more slowly, just Miss Clara. In the cabin, the old folks felt the change. Their world, which had shrunk to the space between their beds, expanded. Their son was home. The ranch was alive. And the quiet, gentle girl who had saved them was now a permanent fixture, her presence as steady as the hearth fire. One evening, Jedediah, his sightless eyes turned toward the sound of Clara humming as she mended, spoke into the quiet. "My boy," he said. Beckett looked up from the harness he was repairing. "Yes, Pa. That girl, Clara." Jedediah's voice was rough with an emotion he rarely showed. She is a good woman, the best of them." "I know, Pa," Beckett said quietly. We misjudged you, son," Elspeth added, her voice a thin, reedy whisper from the alcove. We thought the money had turned your head. We thought you'd abandoned us." "I know," Beckett said again. "We were fools." Jedediah grunted. "Proud, bitter fools. You had your own ghosts to fight, I see that now. This woman, she helped you fight them. You two." He paused, searching for the words. "You two are a matched pair, scars and all." Elspeth's hand fumbled for Clara's, finding it in the dim light. He was talking about second chances. He was right. You were his and he was yours. It's a blessing, child. A hard-won, terrible blessing. Clara squeezed the old woman's hand, her throat too tight to speak. It was the blessing she had never, ever thought she would receive. Beckett said nothing, but he watched her, his heart full. A week later, the legal papers arrived from Cheyenne. They were delivered by a courier, along with a final, satisfied note from Josiah Finch. The case was closed. The forgery was proven. The accusations of theft and moral corruption were withdrawn, with a public apology from Preacher Croft to be printed in the territorial paper. Silas was gone, and the threat was over. Beckett took the papers. He walked outside, where Clara was planting a small garden, her hands deep in the rich, dark earth. The sun was warm on her back, her hair tied up in a practical knot. He stood there for a moment, just watching her. This small, resilient woman who was kneeling on his land, tending a garden as if she planned to be there forever. "Clara," he said. She looked up, shielding her eyes from the sun, and smiled. The fear was gone from her face. It was just open. "Is it done?" she asked, seeing the papers. "It's done," he said. "He can't ever touch you again." She let out a long, slow breath and closed her eyes, her shoulders slumping in relief. "Good," she whispered. He held out his hand. "Come with me." Puzzled, She took his hand, wiping the dirt on her apron as he pulled her to her feet. He led her not to the house, but toward the river, his stride long and purposeful. They walked through the new grass, their boots sinking slightly in the soft ground, until they stood on the high bank. The water slid past, wide and green, carrying the last of the meltwater from the mountains. "This is where it all starts," he said, not looking at her, but at the far bank. "The Hale Land. It runs from here, all the way to the Spirit Rock, and south to the Sweetwater Fork. It's a lot of land. It's beautiful," she said, sensing the gravity in his voice. "I hated it," he said, his voice low. "It was the reason I killed Elias. It was the reason I ran. It was a weight I couldn't carry. It was just blood money." He turned to face her. His eyes were clear, his face serious. "It's not anymore. You made it a home. You stayed. You fought for it. You fought for me. You stood in front of a gun. For me. You made this land clean again. Clara." He reached into his coat. He did not pull out a ring. He pulled out a folded, heavy piece of vellum. It was a legal document, fresh from Cheyenne. I don't have pretty words," he said, his voice rough, clumsy. "I'm not a man who knows how, but I don't want to live here without you. I don't want to live anywhere without you." He unfolded the paper. It was a new deed, a deed to the entire Hale Ranch, the land, the house, the water rights. "My lawyer says this is the only way," he said, his face flushing a dull red under his tan. "I told him I wanted it to be as much yours as it is mine. He said the only legal way to do that is if you're my wife." He held it out to her. She looked down. Her eyes scanned the legal, spidery script, and then found the line at the bottom. For the property held by Beckett Hale and Clara Hale, his wife. He was not proposing with a ring, a symbol of possession. He was proposing with a deed. He was giving her half of the only thing he had. He was giving her a home. He was giving her his name. She looked up, her eyes flooding. She had never owned anything, not a dress that wasn't a hand-me-down, not a dollar she hadn't scrubbed for, not a single square foot of land to stand on. She wept. But this time, it was not the weeping of fear, or shame, or loneliness. It was the weeping of a drought-broken land. "Clara?" he asked, his voice raw with panic. "Say something!" She threw her arms around his neck, burying her face in his shirt. "Yes," she choked out, her voice muffled. "Yes, Beckett, yes." He held her, his arms locking around her like steel bands. And for the first time in his life, the millionaire cowboy felt truly, unimaginably rich. Their wedding was 3 days later. It was simple. There was no priest, no church. Neither of them wanted that. They stood on the bank of the river, the same place he had proposed, just as the sun was beginning to set, staining the sky in shades of rose and deep purple. Their only witnesses were his parents. Jedediah, blind but proud, sat on a stool Beckett had carried down, his face turned toward the sound of their voices. Elspeth sat beside him, bundled in her best shawl, her face a mask of quiet, weeping joy. Clara wore her only good dress, a simple blue calico she had mended a dozen times, but she had washed her hair, and it hung down her back, shining in the fading light. Beckett wore a clean shirt. There was no book, no sermon. He just took her hands. His were large, rough, and warm. Hers were small, calloused, and fit perfectly inside them. "I," he said, his voice thick. "Beckett Hale, take you, Clara Middleton, to be my wife, to be my partner. I was lost, and you found me. I will not leave you. I will not fail you. I will love you, all my days." She was crying, but she was smiling. "And I," she whispered, her voice shaking. "Clara Middleton, take you, Beckett Hale, to be my husband. I was nothing. I was a ghost. And you saw me. You gave me a home. You gave me a name. You gave me, I will stand by you. I will honor you. and I will love you all my days." He slid a simple, thin gold band onto her finger. It had been his grandmother's. It was the only thing he had kept. He kissed her. It was not a kiss of passion or of desperation. It was a kiss of promise. It was the sealing of a vow, made not to God, but to each other. They stood by the river as the first stars pricked the deep blue sky. Just a man and a woman, under the vast, open Wyoming sky. Finally, irrevocably, home. In the final scene, months had passed. The deep, howling cold of winter had returned to the valley, but the house was different. It was no longer a grim, cold cabin. It was a home. Beckett had used his money. He had repaired the roof, put new, real glass in the windows, and built a proper, warm room for his parents. The larder was full. The barn was sound. Clara was in the kitchen, which was now bright and warm. A large iron range stood where the meager hearth had been, and it radiated a deep, steady heat. She was humming, stirring a thick, rich stew in a large pot. It smelled of beef and herbs from her dried garden. The door opened, letting in a swirl of snow and a blast of frigid air. Beckett came in, stamping the snow from his boots. He was broader, happier. The lines of guilt had faded from his face. He unwrapped his scarf, his cheeks red from the cold. He stopped, just watching her. Her back was to him. She was no longer thin, but healthy, her figure rounded, her hair in a thick, shining braid. She looked content. He smiled, a deep, easy expression. He walked up behind her and slid his arms around her waist, pulling her back against his cold coat, his chin resting on her shoulder. "Hello, wife," he murmured, his voice half laughing. She leaned back into him, her hands coming up to cover his. "Hello, husband." He nuzzled her neck, then looked at the pot. "You're still feeding my parents." Clara smiled. She turned in his arms to face him, her hands on his chest. "No," she replied, her voice soft but sure. "I'm feeding our home." He looked at her, his heart so full he thought it might burst. He kissed her, a long, slow kiss by the warm hearth, a promise kept. And outside, the Wyoming wind howled, a lonely, wild sound. But it could not touch them. It could not get past the warm, strong walls of the house they had built together. Thank you for listening to this story. I truly hope you enjoyed it. We would love to hear from you. So please, leave a comment and let us know where in the world you are listening from. If you enjoyed this tale, please consider subscribing to From Wild West for more stories just like this one. We value your thoughts, so feel free to share them in the comments. In English, we read every single one.